for the next? Hi everybody, I'm Sean Sweeney. I coordinate trade unions for energy democracy, and as introduced, I'm also with CUNY, private member of CUNY staff or faculty. I think what we've seen in the last few years, certainly since Copenhagen, is an emergence of a very serious movement. It's very multifaceted. There's a division of labor, if you like, within that movement, which is beginning to emerge. It's a very exciting time. I certainly remember the disappointment of Copenhagen, like we all do, and the climate movement arrived, you could say, at that point, to some extent. But since then, it's grown, and there have been other significant changes, I think, in the way that movement operates. Now, I want to focus a little bit on two things. One is the need also to focus on institutional work, and also something other speakers have mentioned, programmatic work. Because it's great that we're getting more people out, fighting stuff, mobilizing people, but moving institutions is often a longer-term challenge. And I want to make reference to the work that's going on in the global trade union movement. This is still a very formidable institution. 200 million organized workers outside of China, another 300 million covered by a collective bargaining agreement. There's all sorts of informal workers' organizations that have been organized around co-ops and around what's called alternative labor around the world. They never show up under a union logo, but they exist. And there's been changes going on at the international trade union level that I want to touch on what's been basically going on. But I want to sort of press rewind a little bit to the COP15 and also the Rio Plus 20 talks. The international trade union movement has been getting involved with the climate issue, largely believing that, yeah, this is a new phase of capitalism. This is a type of capitalism we can have a seat at the table. It seems to be cuddlier and warmer and friendlier than the version we've been dealing with under sort of the most extreme versions of neoliberalism. So why not? Let's push for a representation of workers, and that was played out at the level of the UN in the call for just transition for workers. So the idea was decent work, as per the ILO, International Labour Organization agenda, just transition for workers, but absolutely no full-on confrontation with corporate power. And that was the dominant narrative. It was mainly dominated by the Europeans, to be honest. The European Union, Social Europe. This was a chance for unions in Europe to reinvent social Europe, green social Europe. And so they supported all the climate targets adopted by the European Union, the emissions trading system. They went along with a fairly critical support of all of those initiatives. This had an effect all across the global trade union movement. Remember, we've had 30 years of ideological deterioration. What was the left unions, South Africa, Brazil, South Korea, had lost their ideological bearings during the neoliberal period. Some of them still espouse socialism, some still talk about social ownership, but largely those were meaningless slogans for the most part. They were often working under the presence of governments like the Workers' Party in Brazil or the ANC in South Africa that had largely gone along with a corporate neoliberal agenda with social protections for workers to some degree, some redistribution of wealth. But when we get to the Rio Plus 20 talks, something very interesting happened in Rio de Janeiro. There was a trade union assembly of 400 unions, and because it was in the global south, we had more unions from the south than we would normally have. These international gatherings are often very dominated by rich country unions who've got the money to send people. We don't see many people from Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia there. But at that meeting, because it was in Rio, we have Brazilians, Argentinians in particular, who were present. And in walks the head of the United Nations Environment Programme, Achim Steiner, introduced by the International Trade Union Confederation leadership, and presented the whole green economy is inevitable argument. That it's all going according to plan. That the fossil fuel interests, although they never refer to them, that the green economy, renewable energy is going forward at a phenomenal pace. And so we, in the United Nations Environment Programme, they've sort of conceived, along with our friends at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the International Energy Agency, we who developed this programmatic framework are here to reassure you that you're our friends, all of civil society, you have a seat at the table, and all we have to do is carry on what we're doing. There was uproar in the room. People said, what planet are you living in? First of all, we've seen nothing but more extraction, more pollution, more emissions, more struggle, more repression than any time in our histories. And we are calling for a different set of solutions. The resolution that was adopted there was a mixed bag of green capitalism and socialist revolution. It was very strange. But the amendments that were moved from the floor were calling for things like reclaiming the public sector, defending the commons, expanding democracy, a transition to renewables that was done in the public sphere, not by large multinationals. So after that moment, which was a very inspiring moment, there was a decision taken by some unions to launch a project called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. We felt that not only were the energy trends pointing in a certain direction, the wrong direction, and that renewable energy was not galloping forward at a great pace. In fact, I'll just say parenthetically, don't let me lose my thought on the trade union discussion. The narrative around Paris, I'll just say this is a little aside. One of the things that I think is disappointing about it is the way some of the big greens and even some really good people like 350 have been talking about the world is moving away from fossil fuels. If we go along telling everybody the world is moving away from fossil fuels, we're doing two things. One, we're not telling the truth. And second, we're demobilizing the movement. We're not saying, hey, history's on our side. We're saying, just, wait for the economic forces of renewable energy. We'll soon be at grid parity. And then when we're at grid parity, renewables are going to explode and fossil fuels are going to come crashing down. Don't let the crisis of profitability, present conjunctural crisis of profitability for coal, oil, and gas, convince anybody that this is the end of fossil fuels. It is not. More and more fossil fuels get used because, hey, guess what, guys? It's a lot cheaper to fly on airplanes, to drive cars, and do the rest of it. So cheap fossil fuels is actually part of the problem, notwithstanding the issues around the profitability of the companies. More on that in the discussion if we have time. But the trade union debate was, energy trends are going in the wrong direction, both in terms of a climate, also a pollution question. We have the airpocalypse phenomena in many parts of the world, particularly Asia, India, and China. India had its hottest day on record yesterday, I believe, according to The Guardian. That the energy transition that we thought was going to happen under green capitalism was not happening, and that we needed a new approach that was rooted in the traditions of the trade union movement, public ownership, democratic control, taking key sections, strategic sections of the economy out of the control of capital to socialize it on the basis of public goods. This was a narrative that 30 years ago would have been quite acceptable among many unions, including the global north. Not so in the last 20 years, for all the reasons we know. But the reassertion of that narrative has to go beyond slogans. So even though we can try to move unions back towards a more radical agenda, and we've had some success, and I want to, if there's time, refer to one or two examples. We also have to do the programmatic work, because just asserting social ownership or public control raises a lot of questions. Well, isn't a lot of oil, coal, and gas under public ownership in the world today? The answer is yes. Isn't there a problem with centralized power generation? Shouldn't we all be doing community-level solar? So I think there's real challenges in front of us as a movement to say, okay, how do we actually plan our way out of this fossil-based economy into a renewables-based future in a way that puts equity and social solidarity at the heart of the process? This is not about 5 megawatts of solar on some school or some parking lot. This is about a massive transition. And if we go back to the whole Paris moment, let's look what was agreed. And I think this is an organizing tool for us. Net zero emissions by 2060 or 2070. What does that involve? Well, first of all, the likes of Richard Branson says, just send us the signal and business innovation and entrepreneurship will do the rest. That is laughable.
Yeah.
Then you've got the carbon traders who say, all we need is a price on carbon that happens to be global and around about $150 a ton. Well, guess what? There's 12% of world GHGs are covered by a price, according to the World Bank, and that price is hovering around $9 a ton. And the World Bank can't point to a single instance where emissions trading systems have actually reduced emissions in any appreciable way. They cannot point to a single instance, not in the European Union, which is the largest carbon market, not anywhere else. So this is a gift for us, because what they're saying is not happening. So 47 billion tons of CO2 every year coming into the economy, a global economy that, according to the World Bank, is expected to grow 300% by 2050. And they're putting forward a net zero GHGs by 2060, 2070. This is the biggest gift we can have as a movement. We can just basically say that is absolutely not going to happen, that we need to fight for democratic control over key sectors of the economy, that this is tied up with an anti-austerity narrative, with a human rights narrative, an anti-military narrative, and I believe it's part of a real living politics that's beginning to emerge. I'll try to conclude with a couple of examples, what I think is happening and what's very, very encouraging. The trade union movement, if we can focus on that, if there is a programmatic shift within the global trade union movement, we will reach hundreds of millions of people. If we can re-inspire a layer of leaders and activists around the world who are committed to that agenda, then we have a chance of moving this big institution and working with other movements. We can already begin to see some encouraging signs. In Canada, the New Democratic Party, supported by unions, voted to have a debate in every constituency, every riding they call it in Canada, on the LEAP manifesto produced by Naomi Klein, Avi Lewis, and the team working around them. The LEAP manifesto puts energy democracy right up front and center. That, one or two unions were nervous about it and opposed it, but many other unions supported it. In the UK, Jeremy Corbyn was elected, leader of the Labour Party. 250,000 people joined the Labour Party to vote for him, most of them young people. One of the things he stood on was to break up the Big Six energy cartel and to have energy democracy based on 100% renewable power by 2035. In Syriza, in Greece, although the process is stalled, of course, for all the reasons we know, 100% renewable power in the public sector. We're seeing in the global south, we're seeing new formations being born in trade unions in South Africa, with the new federation being launched later this year. There was a meeting in Johannesburg that adopted a statement which railed against the mineral industrial complex and the extractionist basis of the economy. At the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas 2 weeks ago, years of work fighting fracking inside the unions. 2 or 3 years ago, we launched a thing called Unions Against Fracking. And at first, it was just a website. And then one by one, unions from the south and the north got involved in that and started saying, we should be standing up against fracking. When we got to the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, every 4 years, there was a discussion in the resolutions committee. These debates rarely make the floor of the convention, as you can understand. In the resolutions committee, there was a call for a hemispheric moratorium on fracking that was put forward by the Argentinians. Who opposed it? The AFL-CIO. But the AFL-CIO, and this was very unusual, said, we are not going to take this issue to the floor of the convention because we will lose. We are for regulation. We support Senator Clinton. Most of our unions are backing Hillary Clinton, who's for regulating of shale gas. We can't come out against fracking, but we're not going to oppose this. So the resolution went through. So I conclude, I guess, with a couple of points. The institutional work takes time. We have to have patience with it. But the work that's going on outside, the activist communities, Blockadia, is helping our cause enormously. Because there are people in labor who see the death of the labor movement in 10, 20 years unless they change course. And that is helping, seeing that activism is helping driving a new agenda. The institutional work is important. The programmatic work is equally important. In Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which now is on 50 unions supporting it, many of them representing tens of millions of workers, that we've been fighting against the commitment to carbon trading. We've been fighting against carbon capture and storage as a solution. So we're taking on the trade union bait in order to move the program in the right way. But I applaud all the work everybody's doing right now.